Today in the Daily Dose, child labor in America. During colonial times through the first half of the 19th century, child labor was an important part of agriculture and the handicraft economies of the time, employing children on family farms or as indentured servants, while young boys entering the trades began apprenticeships by age 10 to 14. But when the Industrial Revolution in America witnessed a logarithmic increase in factories, children became ideal candidates for a variety of reasons, including less wages and almost no ability to organize into labor unions. As immigration into the United States increased in the 19th and early 20th centuries, children under the age of 16 became an increasingly important resource for profit-hungry business owners, growing to 18% of the American workforce by 1900. While average Americans may have questioned the validity of employing the young, most accepted child labor as a mainstay of working-class American families, although many case examples shine a light on early public awareness to a growing national problem. For instance, in the September 6, 1906 edition of Cosmopolitan magazine, a journalist reported on a visit to Manhattan by a Native American chieftain from out west, who took in the soaring heights of skyscrapers, the majesty of the Brooklyn Bridge, along with comfortable masses gathered at the circus, as well as equal masses of poor Americans huddled in wretched tenements unfit for human habitation. When asked about the most surprising thing that the chieftain had seen during his visit, the chief replied, "Little children working." A second awareness example comes from Sarah Ann Cleghorn, who wrote that the golf links lie so near the mill that almost every day, laboring children can look out and see grown men at play. Just as slavery was far from unique to America only, child labor, on the other hand, had its early roots in both the United Kingdom and its colonies in the New World. Children have always worked, notes Hugh Hindman in his book Child Labor. Americans in the 18th century welcomed a newborn child, not so much as a blessing from God, but as a future beneficial worker within the family and an insurance policy for old age. Beginning at age 5, children were expected to participate in the seemingly endless work on farms, ranging from planting crops, feeding chickens, performing household chores, or mending fencing, in many cases making child labor a vital necessity in a farm family's survival. In his book Crusade for the Children, author Walter Tratner points to child labor's origins in early man, when tribes wandered the land as hunter-gatherers. Everyone, young and old, participated in the daily necessity of acquiring sufficient protein and calories. And when tribes divided further into families, children continued as equal contributors to a family's individual success, caring for livestock and crops with a sense of responsibility and purpose unequaled by their parents. The medieval guild system further legitimized children's participation in the trades, and as capitalism created new social pressures, in 1575, Britain's Parliament provided the use of public funds to employ children in order to accustom them to labor and afford a prophylactic against vagabonds and paupers. When the Puritans became an early voice in colonial America, they brought with them the belief that work was the cornerstone of a human's moral compass, which in turn shaped a citizenry that increasingly praised work and scorned idleness. The growth of manufacturing during the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early to mid-19th centuries, however, provided an enormous opportunity for societies to overlook the perceived problems of an idle child. The introduction of machines lessened the complexity of many jobs, making them suitable for child labor amidst a rising demand for workers, leading one British industrialist in 1790 to propose the construction of textile factories around London, employing children only to, in his words, prevent the habitual idleness and degeneracy pandemic in London's tenements of the day. Similarly, in the States, colonial laws had long been modeled after British laws, which sought ways to prevent children from becoming an economic burden on society, citing child labor as a way to develop a child's productive capacity throughout each successive phase of their working life. After England's heavy-handed taxation of her colonies, all without representation in Parliament, economic tensions began to escalate between Great Britain and her American possessions, giving rise to an independent manufacturing sector in America that favored women and children as workers, which then allowed the man of a given household the opportunity to continue the Jeffersonian ideal of a yeoman farmer. The practice also jibed well with then Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, whose commercial vision for America encouraged the use of children as a cheap source of labor. Mirroring Hamilton's 1790 comments on child labor, the influential Niles Register, one of the first national news weekly magazines in America, noted that mechanized factory work was no longer suited for able-bodied men, but rather better done by little girls from 6 to 12 years old, leading industrialists of the time to view child labor as an asset to societal well-being. By way of example, an 1802 advertisement in the Baltimore Federal Gazette newspaper sought children aged 8 to 12 to work in a cotton mill, stating, "It is hoped that those citizens having a knowledge of families, having children destitute of employment, will do an act of public benefit by directing them to the institution in question." As the practice of child labor continued its steady rise during America's Industrial Revolution, families began choosing one community over another based on employment opportunities, not only for the parents, but also for their offspring. So much so that by 1820, children made up more than 40% of mill workers in at least 3 New England states. That same year, Niles Register calculated that if the average mill employed 200 children from the age of 7 to 16 who previously produced nothing toward their own maintenance, each working child would produce $13,500 per year in value for a given New England community. Even orphanages got on the child labor bandwagon when aid groups such as the Charles Loring Brace Children's Aid Society, or CAS, established its first house for orphan boys in 1854 under a model that would treat the lads as independent little dealers and give them nothing without payment, thereby avoiding the growth of a future dependent class. To that end, CAS taught orphan boys the skills of honest trades such as shoemaking, blacksmithing, and cooperage. CAS received a second boost by abolitionists who saw the free labor of children as a symbol of freedom in their fight against the spread of slavery in the newly forming Western states. The perceived societal benefits of child labor as a hedge against the sin of idleness was further elevated by the American Civil War, which saw women and children dominate factory floors, while American men fought each other to the death. Advances in post-Civil War manufacturing techniques further increased opportunities for child labor, as productive capacities continued to skyrocket the American economy. The period also saw a pronounced blurring of the term free labor, which now included functionally re-enslaved African Americans who had no choice but to sign apprentice agreements with their former slave masters. Forced to sign by necessity, emancipated parents exchanged the labor of their children in return for training, which was viewed by American courts during the Reconstruction-era South as beneficial to emancipated children, since former slaveholders were deemed much more fit to teach a free child the habits of industry than their recently freed parents. Similar abuses took place in New York City and Italy as well, when the existence of Italian padrones catered to mainly Italian immigrants freshly arrived through Ellis Island, or for those who had not yet sailed for America. Under the guise of an apprenticeship, padrones on the Italian mainland frequently deceived parents and children alike when they arranged apprenticeships in the States for children, primarily for teaching a child how to play a musical instrument. Once agreements were signed, children were swept off to America, where they were forced into the life of a street performer for the financial benefit of the padrone, leading a New York Times journalist to write in 1873 that the world has given up on stealing men from the African coast, only to kidnap children from Italy. Although the egregious situations involving former slaves and victims of the Italian padrones faded by the end of the 19th century, according to the census of 1870, 1 out of every 8 children was employed, while by the turn of the century, the rate had increased to 1 out of every 5 children in America. Nor was age the only determining factor of the term big enough to work, since a given child's size frequently overruled the pigeonhole of numerical age. Child labor also defined the growing divide in America between the haves and the have-nots, since the concept of idle youth was not shared by the upper classes, leading a well-to-do father to write in 1904, "We work for our children, plan for them, spend money on them, buy life insurance for their protection, and some of us even save money for them." By the dawn of the 20th century, child labor of the rural working class saw boys under 14 toiling in mines, breaking up coal deposits with their bare hands, while young boys in urban areas took to hawking newspapers or carrying telegrams and messages. Mills and glass factories were a particular magnet for youth employment, while young children routinely worked in fields performing farm labor, while many others in coastal regions worked in the seafood industry. Home-based businesses flourished as well, leading many financially struggling middle-class parents to see their children as the only resource they could bring to bear in their ongoing struggle to put food on the table and a roof over their head. During the height of the child labor era in America, newspaper boys or newsies became a growing nuisance for big city politicians when newsies hawked their papers on street corners with frequently embellished or shocking headlines meant to sell more papers than the hawker down the street. Since newsies bought their supply of newspapers from the publisher, the arrangement only meant that newsies profited when they sold a paper, which in turn created fierce competition for the best street corner location, as well as the ability to hype up flashy headlines on busy news days, while shouting out false headlines or shortchanging customers, particularly during the late-night hours. During the First World War, newsies shouting out false headlines became such a nuisance in Cleveland, Ohio, prompting city leaders to threaten prosecution against any newsie shouting out false and amazing statements, while a New York Times article in October of 1917 outlined efforts by police to stop newsies from drumming up baseless headlines about the war, just to sell more newspapers. By the mid-19th century, educational reformers began a concerted pushback against child labor practices, impressing upon the American public that proper education was a dire necessity if the nation was to prosper as a whole. To highlight the dangers, long hours, and unsafe working conditions for child labor, New York photographer and teacher Louis Hine photographed children working in a wide assortment of industries from 1908 to 1924, spotlighting the issue in newspapers and magazines across the country. During the late 19th and early 20th century, Progressive-era reformers embraced the haunting photography of Chaim, making the end of child labor an important part of their platform. And after the National Child Labor Committee organized in 1904, reformers employed an array of tactics to increase public awareness regarding the filthy, oftentimes hazardous conditions experienced by child laborers, including investigations by experts, persuasive congressional lobbying campaigns, and mass mailings to the public at large. A constitutional amendment was passed by Congress in 1924. However, state pushback, particularly in southern states, killed any chance for ratification. The end finally came when the Great Depression left thousands of adult Americans without jobs, leading to FDR's sweeping New Deal reforms, which in effect removed children from the workforce. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act set a national minimum wage for the first time in American history, at the same time limiting worker hours and making the use of children under 16 years of age illegal in manufacturing and mining. Individual states also began increasing the number of years of schooling required for certain jobs, while lengthening the school year and strictly enforcing truancy laws, making child labor a disgraceful yet bygone era in American history. And there you have it, child labor in America, today on the Daily Dose. If you enjoyed this short educational video, consider giving the filmmakers a YouTube super thanks from as little as $1, so that you too can feed the filmmakers who feed your brain.